Quick warning, today's video contains subject matter that may be sensitive to some viewers, and as always, viewer discretion is advised. Also, if you have a story you want to send my way, go to astheravendreams.com and click the button that says submit your story. And of course, thank you. I've never really told anyone about this story, with very few exceptions. Basically, I've only ever mentioned it to two people. One of them I married, and the other one really isn't in my life anymore. It didn't matter when I mentioned it to them, mostly because it was several years after the fact, and they didn't really seem interested in it when I told them about it, which probably speaks a little to why they aren't in my life anymore. Anyways, that said, I was listening to a few YouTube narrators tell creepy encounter stories, and I realized that I could go ahead and tell my story to the internet, and then maybe someone out there would care. And maybe I'm overreacting with the whole thing, but it was just one of those situations that seriously freaked me out when I was younger, and it still kind of makes me sick to my stomach when I think about it now. I was young when this happened, like 14 or 15. Now, to tell you a bit more about who I was and how my life was back then, when I was around 6, I ended up being dumped into the foster system and had been cycled through a couple of families for various reasons. One of the things that you're not really told about the foster system, that you have to be a part of it to realize, there are people that adopt kids for money. It is absolutely a thing that happens, and when it does, the kids usually don't live their best lives. I was one of those kids. My foster parents had 4 other adoptees that they pretty much just ignored, and they collected a check each month from the government. Because of this, I was pretty much left to my own devices from the time I was 6 to the time I was 16. After that, I had actually moved out of the foster home and in with a friend of mine, whom I actually ended up married to. Being left to do whatever I wanted most of my life led to me doing things that I shouldn't have. I'm not going to beat around the bush. When I was 14 or so, I had already done a few different drugs, and I was already drinking pretty frequently with people I should not have been hanging out with. I honestly don't even remember how I ended up with that crowd that I did, but I would frequently go out after school on Friday nights and hang out with people that were older than me. I would drink with them until I would black out, or until I just couldn't feel anything. Surprisingly, none of them ever did anything to me. I was 14 and very vulnerable, and seeing as how I would black out at the house with 4 or 5 guys that were anywhere between 17 and 24, they easily could have sexually assaulted me. But none of them ever even tried to even hit on me. I think they looked at me as a younger sister, and not enough to try to steer me in the right path, but enough that none of them looked at me in that way. That said, this specific event and situation was one where I wish I would have just drank until I blacked out and slept it off over there. But I didn't. Now, for the most part, I would get to the point where I would have zero memory of the night before, but on this night, I wasn't feeling it, and I only drank enough to be kind of numb. I was still mostly conscious and able to focus. Because of this, I decided that at around 1:30 in the morning, I would walk from their house to my house, which wasn't too far, but it was definitely far enough that a drunk 14-year-old girl should not have been considering walking it, especially since it was January and somewhere in the neighborhood of 0 degrees Fahrenheit. But brave, stupid little old me was completely invincible, and I wanted to go home so I could sneak in and sleep in my own warm bed. I have no idea why I wanted to do that. I would have been warm and safe there. I just know that I wanted to. The walk home started simple enough. I told them I was leaving, walked out into the snow-covered yard, and tried to keep my footing on the frozen sidewalk. About 300 feet from the house, I started thinking that this was stupid and that I was going to freeze to death, or fall and break something, but I was also a dumb kid, and decided to just buck it up and go the whole way. Now, I wasn't exactly bundled up for snow, but thankfully it had stopped at this point. I just had to deal with the wind and the freezing cold. I had a coat, sure, but I was also wearing shorts, which was something that I was definitely regretting pretty quickly. Despite these complaints, I was determined, and after about half an hour, I was at the home stretch. I could see my front yard from the corner that I was at, and I would be there in somewhere close to 5 or 10 minutes. As soon as I took the turn onto my street, I heard that sound of a front door and screen door opening, and then closing just to my left. I didn't think much of it at first, but then I heard someone yell, "Hey," in my direction. I wanted to ignore it, but my inebriated brain told me to look over and see who was calling for me, which was dumb, because I didn't know any of the people on this street, with the exception of our direct neighbors. I glanced over to see who it was, and my stare was met with an older man, probably somewhere in his 60s, standing in his yard with his hands on his hips, and literally no clothes on. When I say no clothes, I mean nothing. No underwear, no robe, no socks, no shoes, not even a hat or anything. He was hanging out in all the glory of the day he was born. As soon as I made eye contact, his angered face quickly turned to a devious smile, and he said, "Why are you out here so late, sweetheart?" I turned back to look ahead so as to not be staring at this naked dude surrounded by snow, and just said, "I'm just walking home. Sorry to bother you." Which was probably just a response that came from my dumb, drunk brain. He then starts to walk towards me from his front door, and says something like, "Why don't you come on in? It's too cold to be out here." To which that same drunk brain decided to be a smartass and say, "Yeah, I can tell." As soon as I made my snide quip, this dude started yelling obscenities at me as loud as he could, and started to speed up in my direction. As soon as I heard him running towards me, I took off into a sprint towards my house. I turned back and I saw that he was following me as fast as he could. Thankfully, I was about 50 years younger, and probably close to 200 pounds lighter than him at the time, so I was able to get a bit of a lead. Unfortunately, around the point where I hit my yard, I realized two things. It was 1:30 in the morning, and no one in my house was going to be awake, and I didn't have a key to the front door. My original plan of sneaking in wouldn't have worked as it was, and at this point, I was stuck with having to break in. But that wasn't going to work since I had the naked old man seriously tailing me into my own yard. The only thing I was going to be able to do was get into my backyard and hope that the outside door to the detached garage was unlocked, and then hope that he would eventually give up on his chase. I got to my yard and hopped the wooden fence, and immediately was hopeful that that would be enough to stop him. Almost as if he read my mind, he literally shouted, "Huh, you're gonna make me work for you, huh?" The tone of his voice seriously sickened me, and just replaying it in my head makes me get those same chills down my spine. I took off around the house and got to the rear garage door, and almost as if God himself responded to my panicked request, I grabbed the knob and it turned. I literally leapt into the garage and shut the door behind me, and then locked it. I was sitting there on the ground with my back against the door, freaking out, and thinking that this guy was seriously going to get me. That he was going to just break the glass on the door and open it and then abduct me. I heard him huffing and shouting at me, saying things like how he only needed me for a couple of minutes, and how he promised that it wouldn't hurt too much. This guy was seriously a predator, and he was hunting me. I heard him walking around the backyard. I heard him put his hands on the garage doorknob and try it, and then I heard him yell something and walk away. I would have to guess that he didn't realize I was in the garage, because he kept walking around and calling out for me. I want to reiterate that this naked old man had run after me in the snow, climbed over a fence into my own home's backyard, and was still yelling out for me. He obviously had no shame and no care about whether or not someone saw him or noticed him. He had a one-track mind, and getting to me was that track. At some point in time, my brain gave up and my drunk self started to doze off sitting on the floor of the garage. I was freezing cold, drunk, and scared, but I was also exhausted, and I ended up just falling asleep right there against the door. My guess is, when he realized I wasn't outside anymore or wasn't in a place that he could get to me, he gave up and went back home. Mostly because, when I woke up, it was to one of my older brothers opening the garage door to leave for work. He basically told me to go inside and go to bed, which I did, mostly because I knew that this hangover was probably going to suck. This was seriously the most terrifying thing to have ever happened to me. The fact that this old, naked man was willing to run into the freezing weather to chase me down the street, enter into my backyard to get to me, and then yell while right outside my home about what he was going to do to me was, well, it was horrifying. It's even worse that either no one in my family woke up to it or cared enough to see what the hell was going on. Like I said, I'm much older now, pushing into my late 40s, and am married to someone that actually does love me. It just pains me and sickens me to know what he was probably looking to do to me, and I'm thankful for the fact that I was able to get away from him. But I also worry with how brazen he was about everything. I'm thinking that I may not have been the first person that he had targeted. This is a bit of an unconventional, scary story, and to some, it may seem more strange than terrifying, but for me, it was probably one of the few moments in my life where I was seriously scared. I don't scare easily, and I do have a bit of a tough guy bravado about me. And sure, I may be a bit ignorant to the ways of the world, but I like to believe I can hold my own out here in this big bad world. That said, no. When the whole thing went down, I was feeling like a wimp. So, in order to really tell the story, we have to establish some background. Of course. Isn't that how all these scary stories go? Back when this happened, I had just turned 17 a month prior, which would have been around December of 2014. I had applied for and successfully landed my first job at a certain sandwich shop. One that's definitely well known, but nowhere near the size of Subway or anything. Despite the fact that the interview was literally just How old are you and have you ever worked fast food before? I was seriously excited to have landed the job at all. This shop had a handful of employees, a couple shift leads, a manager, and then an owner that owned two of the same shop. I will also mention that not all the locations were franchised, such as his two locations. A lot of them were owned locally and independently, and basically just paid for the brand recognition. They had to follow the corporate guidelines for the product, but that was it. This being the case, it was actually kind of nice working there, as they paid better than the franchised locations, and they were a lot more lax on how things were done. So long as the place stayed clean and the customers stayed happy, we weren't harassed or pushed to do menial tasks just because we had free time. There wasn't a whole lot of free time, but when it wasn't busy, we were pretty much free to sit in the back and chat. One of the surprising things that I noticed when I started working there was that the owner would occasionally work behind the line, and would also sometimes close the shop with the managers. This was a bit odd to me. I thought the whole point of owning a small place like this was to pretty much not work, but still reap the rewards. But it was also kind of nice because the owner was a pretty legit dude. He was actually the person that I had my welcome aboard meeting with, and he was kind, professional, and seemed to be genuinely supportive. The managers were pretty decent, and the rest of the staff did their job well enough. I think all of this really led to an environment that was welcoming for everyone, and the customers could tell. So, all that is the background. A good place to work, decent employees and management, and the owner was probably the nicest person to ever own a sandwich shop. With all that out there, it didn't take long for me to see some of what was actually going on, specifically with the owner. I started the job in December, probably 2 weeks before Christmas, and in my second week, I was working a shift with the owner and one of the managers. During the shift, a large black SUV pulled up to the front spot, and in walked two very well-dressed businessmen. At this point, we weren't busy, so I happily washed my hands, put on some gloves, and then turned around to ask how I could help these gentlemen. Now, again, I'm not a small dude, and I'm confident in my abilities to hold myself, but these guys, something about them was intimidating. As soon as I turned around, one of the guys asked for Marcus, who was the owner of the establishment. Almost as if on cue, Marcus walks out from the back and tells me that he will take care of these two, and that I should go ahead and take a 10-minute break outside. He was very pushy about this, and as much as I didn't want to go out into the snow, I went ahead and did what he asked. As I was headed out the back door, I was stopped for a second by the manager, and I told him that Marcus told me to go out back and take a break because of two guys asking for him in the front. As soon as I said this, he let me go and headed into the shop, but I could tell by the look on his face, these guys were a big deal. Now, when two grown men react to visitors like this, it's obvious that something is up, and it's either not legal or it's ethically questionable. In the end, it wasn't my business, so I let it go and took a break out back. About a week later, a situation like this played out the same when the same guys showed up. Except this time, Marcus wasn't there. I told them as such, and when I mentioned that I would be happy to help them, the look they gave me, it felt like daggers. I then mentioned that I could also go get my manager if that would help, and then shouted to the back for Corey, the manager that was there the last time this happened. He got to the front and, much like Marcus, told me to go ahead and take a 10 out back. By this point, I kind of just assumed the situation was flat out something illegal, like drugs, and I didn't want to be involved with it. So I just said screw it and went out to my car. It was snowing, and if I was going to take a break, I was going to do so comfortably. For about a month, this didn't happen. No suited men, no scared managers, nothing like that. And things were pretty normal at the store. Then, somewhere around the end of January, I was working with the owner on a closing shift, and the manager that was supposed to be on duty had to call in, so it was just the two of us. We had finished up the dinner shift for the night, and I was in the back doing dishes and cleaning when I heard Marcus say something like, "Sorry, we're actually closing up for the night." But he trailed off near the end, like he was surprised by something. I thought maybe it was someone he knew, completely blanking on the two guys, so I just kept doing the dishes. Until I looked over and saw him walking back, being followed by, you guessed it, the two fancy guys from the black SUV. The only difference was that, this time, they were pushing him to the back and they both had guns trained right on him. This is where I kind of fell apart mentally and became that wimp. I pretty much just pushed myself with my back against the wall and put my hands up in hopes that I wouldn't be a victim of whatever was going on here. I think they were a bit surprised to see me there and not the other manager, because they paused for a moment and started talking to each other in a language that I didn't understand. Marcus then said something to them in that same language, I'm assuming telling them that I had nothing to do with any of what was going on, and to leave me alone. They didn't seem to like him back-talking, as one of them shoved him to the ground and then pointed the gun at me. To say that I became a baby would be an understatement. I was 17. I'd been working, making sandwiches for a little over a month, and I'd been working to save money for a car, which was a dumb thing to think about, but it was all I could get into my brain. I was about to die and not get my car. This was the end of it for me, and I had no idea why. The guy that wasn't pointing his gun at me grabbed me by the shirt and walked me over to the walk-in. He stood me facing away from him and kicked the back of my knee so that I fell into a kneeling position. This was that make-or-break moment, and I honestly thought I was dead. Thankfully, I heard him grab something and then felt him tying my hands and feet up in duct tape. He tied me up to the point where I couldn't move at all, and then shoved me down and shut the door. I just kind of laid there on the floor and stared at the meat on the shelf and thought, my God, those guys were cartel or something, and I almost just died. I tried to listen to what was being said, but they were speaking the other language, so I had no idea what they were saying. I heard Marcus screaming, I heard them yelling, and then I heard the door to the back slam shut, and nothing. It was silent. I was seriously tied up in the walk-in, and it was about 10 o'clock at night. No one was going to be coming into that store until around 9 the next morning. And my parents probably weren't going to worry about me since I had a habit of crashing at my friends' houses. What's worse, with how cold it was, how scared I was, and how much adrenaline was seriously making my heart pump, there was no way I was going to fall asleep. I just kind of sat there and stared at the wall for the entire night, and felt like I was freezing. Thankfully, this was the walk-in fridge and not the actual freezer, so while it was cold, it probably wasn't going to kill me. The next morning, I was beyond ecstatic to hear someone come in, and I was screaming as loud as I could to get their attention. Needless to say, they were a bit more than shocked to find me bound and lying on the floor. They got me out and they called the cops, as well as the manager, who showed up in 5 minutes flat and started asking questions about the whole thing. He was there and trying to gather more information than the police were, which made me realize that he had a stake in this whole thing too. He didn't really seem keen on speaking to the police about the whole thing, but after I was questioned, I was given a number to call with more information and told that I could leave. That's, honestly, my whole story with this. To the best of my knowledge, they never found the owner, dead or alive, or the two men. And my guess is that they're no longer in the country. The store actually ended up closing, and I'm pretty sure the police started investigating the whole thing, but they didn't bother me anymore after that. I also didn't go back after that night, and decided to just focus on school. I will say that I feel bad about whatever happened to Marcus, but I'm beyond thankful that they decided I wasn't enough of a threat that they needed to take me with them, wherever it is that they went. So I have a creepy story that happened back when I used to do snow removal for a bunch of rental properties. So, back around 2010. For a slight bit of backstory, I worked for a small company that did contract work for the aforementioned rentals. They would load us up 2 or 3 to a pickup. We would go out to the properties while it was snowing or just after a snowstorm, and it would be our job to plow out the parking lots, shovel the main stretch of sidewalk, and drop some ice melt. And just make sure everything was good to go for the residents by the time they got up to go to work. We weren't exactly detail-oriented. We were pretty much just told to move the snow out of the way and make sure that no one would slip, fall, or otherwise hurt themselves in the common areas. It was probably one of the most strenuous jobs a person could possibly do. Wake up at 3 in the morning, load up into a truck, get to the sites, and start shoveling. And that last part was my main duty. I didn't get to drive the truck. I was the newbie, so I was told to run the shovels on the sidewalks and drop the ice melt. It was miserable, but it paid all right for what it was. Plus, I only had to work about 5 hours on the days where we had to do the removals. So, on the date in question, back around 2010, our area had gotten a lot of snow and we had 4 properties we were supposed to do, which meant that we were going to be out until around 8, removing the snow. We loaded up, and we got through the first 3 with relative ease. No real problems beside being cold as hell and dealing with a mild case of frostbite. And then we headed out to the final property, which was a bit of an uppity style property. By that, I mean that it was a full-on rental property that was owned by a big real estate company, and it was a bunch of townhomes and duplexes around what was essentially its own block. The part that makes it uppity were the people, prices, and the property's requirements. The people were snooty, the prices were outrageous for the area, and the property management were the only people that we ever had problems with. For the most part, the properties we worked with had one requirement: make the snow not block the way of cars. This specific property, however, was super anal about where the snow went, the direction that we plowed in, and the type of ice melts that we used. Yes, they had a specific brand that they required we used because they claimed it was less harmful to the cement. We get the first half of the property done and cleared out, And when we get to the southeast corner, we notice that there's already a pile of snow in one of the parking spots. Like someone had used a small plow or a large shovel to move it into a pile about 4 feet or so tall, and they had filled the entire handicapped spot. We kind of sat there for a moment, trying to figure out what to do. If we should call the office, tell them that one of their tenants had left a pile of snow shoveled in one of the spots. But I made a comment about how they would just blame us because it wasn't in the designated snow zone. My boss sighed and paused for a second, thinking about what we should do. The spot wasn't large enough for him to maneuver in, and there were cars next to it anyways, which meant we were going to have to get out and move the snow back out into the parking lot so we could then plow it into the correct area. This meant a lot of manual labor to move a pile of snow, just to repile the snow elsewhere, which then also meant that I was the one that had to get out and do it. I hopped out of the truck and walked back to get the shovel, and then went over to the pile of snow and attempted to push some of it off the top. And of course, it had become a chunk of ice more than just a pile of snow. I smacked at some with the shovel to loosen it up, but had to climb over it and start breaking chunks off. But I was getting nowhere fast. I motioned for my boss and our coworker to come over and help me. They parked and grabbed the shovels, and we all started chipping away at the parking lot iceberg. It took us a few minutes to get a good portion of it out of the parking lot, but when we had gotten most of the way through, I noticed that there was actually something in the snow pile. It didn't take long for all 3 of us to realize what we were looking at. It was an arm, and that arm was attached to a torso. This pile of snow that a tenant had packed so carefully into this parking spot wasn't done out of frustration of said tenant. This was a temporary grave. We immediately dropped the shovels and ran back to the truck. My boss grabbed the phone and called 911 to report it, and he told me to call the property management. The management showed up first, then the police and the EMS. Though EMS wasn't going to be able to do much. This person was quite obviously dead. They had us help remove the ice as best as we could from around her so they could get her out and attempt to identify. As soon as we were able to get her uncovered, it was pretty clear how she died. There were multiple stab wounds to the chest and stomach area. The management was able to identify her right away. It was one of their elderly tenants that lived in the building that was just to the right of the parking spot. They told the police that she lived alone and that no one in the area had any problems with her or anything. We were pretty much told by management that our job was done there, and the police thanked us for our help. We packed our stuff back up and decided that we were done for the day. My boss said that he felt like we should take a couple days off because of how messed up the situation really was. After a few days, when we all met back up, my boss had actually told us that he was able to contact the management of the property and talk with them about the situation. And they told him a little bit more about it. This older woman was a decent tenant, but she had apparently moved her son into the basement without the knowledge of management. And her son had a drug problem. It was basically a case of her wanting him to live with her and get better, but he was set in his ways. And apparently they'd had a disagreement that night, and he killed her and then buried her in the snow somewhere around 3 a.m. If we had chosen to do our route backwards, as we sometimes did, and we went to that property first thing, we probably would have run into him burying her. We all kind of guessed that he knew she would likely be found eventually, and that it would be easier to just cover her in the snow as it was likely to not melt for a couple of weeks. Plus, he may have thought that we would just pile more snow onto the spot when we plowed it. He was caught, thankfully, because he had taken his mother's car and attempted to get as far away as he could. Thankfully, he was the main suspect, and they put out a call for the car. So, when it was spotted literally 2 towns over that same day, he was pulled in, and he told them about what he had done. I actually did this job for a couple more years after this incident, but every time we approached a pile of snow that was more than a foot high, I think my boss and I both kind of clenched, wondering if it was going to happen again. Thankfully, it never did. So this was a collection of 3 true scary winter-based stories. Stories of the winter. And some damn good stories they were, honestly. Creepy, to be honest with you. All 3 of them, legit have a genuinely terrifying aspect to them. And I am glad to have never been in any of the positions of these people, but I genuinely appreciate everyone who sends me their stories, as well as anyone who lets me use their stories from Reddit. All of you are amazing, and thank you very much. What did you guys think of these stories? Were they seriously creepy? Because I think they were, but you all have your opinions, and I'd love to hear them. And if you really liked the video and want to leave me that comment down below as well, you can, but please consider also hitting that little thumbs up button, the little button that tells me you liked the video. You all can't see the numbers, but I can, and it helps a lot. So, huge thank you to everybody who listens to this point, and to everyone who supports the channel over on Patreon or channel memberships down below, where for $1 you can get early access to all my content. And yeah, I don't really have anything else to plug or push or talk about, so how's your day going? How's the weather out where you are? Is it nice? It's dry here. Can you tell? Can you tell it in my voice that it's dry here? And it's hard for me to talk, and that I am straining myself with every single word that I say. Because I am. But anyways, I hope you all have a beautiful day, and I hope the weather's nice. Like I said, I didn't say that, but I hope it's weather's nice. Hope the weather's nice there for you. I'll talk to y'all later, and see you next time. But until then, of course, sleep well.